Good evening, everybody. My name is Brian Morrison, software developer based out of Chicago, Illinois. Hope you're all having a lovely evening. It's evening where I'm at least, 8:30 p.m. Central up here in Chicago. This is a continuation of a series I've been doing on AWS and Vue, specifically serverless functions in AWS and how to build kind of an entire application using AWS and Vue. Originally what started out to be a 2-part series is now probably turning into like a 4 or 5-part series. So today specifically, I'm going to focus on how to add the ability to upload attachments into AWS from the Vue app. The basic flow of things is we're going to use a file input type in the front end. We're going to convert the file to a base64 encoded version of that file, which is just straight text. We're going to post that to an API endpoint, which is going to be hosted through API Gateway as well as Lambda to process the data, and then the file is eventually going to be stored in AWS S3, which is used for blob storage or just straight object storage. And then we're going to, after the end of that, we're going to return a URL back to the front end and then update the actual object before we save it back to our API. Yeah, we got a lot of cool stuff that we're going to be going through today. Diamond, William, Dennis, how are you guys doing tonight? Thanks for stopping by. Okay, so let's just get straight into it. So what I've got here so far is AWS I have pulled up. I guess I'll give a quick recap of what we did last week when we did the stream, which was kind of, it was kind of part one, even though there was the previous week I also did some stuff with putting the Vue app up in AWS. But anyway, this is our basic app right here. All it is a simple input here. There's a button where you can add a task, where you could also click enter to add a task. And this is a task, just to show you what this thing looks like. Sorry, one sec. And so it adds it to the list. When that data is processed, it's sent up through API Gateway, which is used to present AWS services through an API endpoint. Through Lambda, which is our serverless functions. That's what takes the data and processes it. It's all written in Node.js. And then Dynamodb is actually where we store the data. So I can actually go into the database here, go into tables. Vue To Do App is the table that I had created last week when we were doing this, and here is the item. I gotta get rid of that actually, because I was testing some stuff out. But this is actually what the data is going to look like when we actually upload it. Okay, so with that said, we're going to start by creating an S3 bucket up in AWS. So to access S3, you can see I have it under recently visited services, but if you don't, and they just changed the layout of this, like since last week on stream, this looked a little bit different, but they have added this global search feature up top, which is really cool. I really like it. If you just type in S3 from the home page, you can see there's S3 right there. You don't want Glacier, because Glacier is like long-term archival storage, not used for what we want to use it for. So select S3. And this will bring you to a list of your S3 buckets. We already have an S3 bucket for some stuff we were doing with testing, but we need to create a new one that we're going to use to store our images. And that's kind of what we're going to use instead of like file attachments. The process is exactly the same way, but I figured with an image we can present it on the screen so we can actually see it to make sure that the data gets uploaded and the image can be accessed. So again, like I said earlier, S3 is used for blob storage or unstructured data. It's kind of similar to like a file and folder structure on your computer, but it has a lot more functionality, and it is a little bit different in some cases. But a bucket is kind of the top level storage mechanism for S3. So this is where you generally want to start. So we're going to create a bucket, and I'm going to call this bucket Vue To Do App Images. And I'm going to put 1, 2, 3 after that. Bucket names need to be globally unique. That's not per account. That's all of AWS. So sometimes I'll throw some random numbers at the end just to make sure that I can get that name. Region, we've got everything in US East 1, so we're going to stay there. Now, this is important for our application, since the files we're uploading do need to be publicly accessible by our app or by any users of the app. We want to uncheck this block public access and then acknowledge it. If you wanted to get really tight in security, you can do some slick integrations with Cognito and S3, where instead of going through Lambda and processing them that way, and instead of requesting them publicly, you can actually create what's called a pre-signed URL. It's basically kind of like a temporary URL to access the file. But for the use case of our application, this is totally sufficient to kind of demonstrate how this stuff works. Everything else can pretty much be left as default, and we can go ahead and click Create Bucket down at the bottom. So here's our bucket that's been created. Let's go ahead and open it up. And there's no files in here. We're not going to actually upload anything. You're not going to see anything here quite yet. But you know, once we start uploading files, we're going to come back here and see what it looks like inside of here. Okay, so part 2 of this, and I'm cruising through this real quick. This might be a short stream tonight. Is we need to create a Lambda function that is going to be able to accept our image uploads. So again, the flow we're going to use is API gateway is the API endpoint we're going to be using to access it. Lambda is what we're going to use to process that data and then store it in S3, and then S3 is where the file is going to be at. So we're kind of doing this in reverse order. So let's head over to Lambda. And I have the same 3 functions that we had created on the last stream last week. Let's create a new function, and we're going to set the name of this function upload image function. And scroll down. We're going to be using Node.js, so Node.js 12 is fine. Now, under change default execution, again, if you've been following along, we created a special role that we can use across all of our Lambda functions, which include the ability to access Dynamodb. So I'm going to click Use an existing role. We're going to select our Vue To Do App role, and then click Create Function. Okay, and if we scroll down a little bit, you're going to see there's this this function code section. This is where we actually have an inline editor up in Lambda where we can edit the code. You can zip up a package and upload it to Lambda, but since we're not really doing anything crazy with our code, we're just using built-in AWS services. We really don't need to do that. So we're going to open this up just so I get a little more space to work with. I'm going to delete everything that's in here, and I'm going to copy in some code that I prepared ahead of time. Just to and I'll step through all this stuff and explain what it all does. So up top, there's the initial dependency for the AWS SDK. Now, if you're working with AWS services, specifically Lambda, they always give you the AWS SDKs that are kind of installed globally inside of their containers, so we don't have to manually install this. This is already going to be available for us. The region we're using is the region and bucket name are going to be used for when we upload the files, and then also when we create the URL that's sent back to from our initial request with the URL to that image. And then this put object to S3 is a function that I've written a while ago, which kind of streamlines some of the process of actually, you know, putting an object up in S3. So just kind of stepping through this, we have the bucket name, we have the key, which is like it's the path of the file, including the file name that's going to be stored, the content type, and then the data, which is that base64 encoded string that we're going to send up into AWS. So we're creating an object with all those parameters and then passing them into s3.putObject. And then this is going to be used by our actual handler down here. So coming from last week, I'll kind of re-explain this one more time. So everything, whenever you create a Lambda function, it has this default exports.handler, and the handler is where, make sure my mic everything's working. This handler function is what is called when a request comes into your Lambda function. So the event that's passed in is actually the data that's sent along with it. Lambda functions, although they're used a lot for APIs like we're using this today, they can also be used for a lot of other things. And so, like, if you're familiar with SQS or queuing services up in AWS, you can hook up a Lambda function to an SQS queue. So when a message comes into your queue, the Lambda function will pick it up, and then that data will be inside of the event body. Now, our event is going to be coming from API Gateway, since that's where we're accessing this function from. So I have a little block here that detects whether the body of it, the request coming in, is either a string or JSON, and then converts it to JSON if it's not. This is because the API Gateway integration will send it through as a string, but if I'm testing it within Lambda, it's going to be an object. So this is just a quick check to make sure that that's set up properly. And then here's kind of like the meat of the function, I guess, if you will. Let me bring this guy back over here. So the key, like I said, is going to be the file name. So what I usually do for data, like file data, is I will put the current year in front of the actual file, and then sometimes I might also put like what type of file it is or something. Since we're only working with images here, we don't really need to be too concerned with that. And then the file name is what we're going to be sending up with the request to save the file. Hey James, thanks for dropping by. Appreciate it. How are you tonight? Okay, so the next two lines on 42 and 43, we're going to, we need to extract the content type. So I'm just, from the file data itself, which I'll show you what that actual object looks like. It comes with whatever content type is being sent right in there. So we can determine that based off of that data that's sent. And then the blob data, I'm converting it using, I'm basically stripping out the content type in the beginning of the string and then taking just the data out of it and creating a buffer out of that and then passing it into my put object s3 function, which I, kind of presented earlier. This is a lot of not very obvious code, but this works, and I've been using this for quite a while, and it works pretty well. So then the last thing we need to do is we're going to create I realize my spacing's all messed up here. Hold on a second, let me fix this. Oh, it doesn't look like, it looks like it's tabbing out 4 times. I did this in 2. Okay. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do is, provided the object's actually been saved here, we can construct a URL to access the object based off of the bucket name, which we discussed earlier, the region as well, and then the key, which is the path to that file. So this really is kind of the important piece. Once the data has been saved in S3 and is accessible, this is what we're going to return back to the user, so this way we can save it into the database. You could kind of take care of these things in a single call if you really want to, but for the sake of the demonstration, I think this is going to work pretty well. And like I said, this is the response body that we're going to send back. So let's go ahead and save this. So I'm going to do Control S to save my code. And then we're going to click deploy up here. Anytime you make changes to a Lambda function, they don't deploy automatically. So if you're ever kind of sitting there and banging your head away against, like, I'm making changes to the code and it's not working, why not? You've got to deploy it out beforehand, because it'll always use whatever version's deployed out into its quote-unquote production environment. So that's just one of those little nuances to keep in mind and be aware of. Okay, so we have 2 pieces of getting our architecture set up in order to upload images. We've got the S3 bucket created, we've got the function created, and the next thing we need to do is go into API Gateway and then update our routes here to get the new function wired up that we just created. So let's go, we're inside of our API. Let's hover over to routes, and let's create a new route. And we're going to set since we're creating data and we're sending it up there, we're going to select post as the method type. And then instead of, we were creating all of our routes with to-dos last time because we were saving that type of data up into AWS. But this is going to be something different. I'm actually going to set this to images because that's the type of data that we're going to save. So let's go ahead and create that route. And now to hook this up to our Lambda function, if we select the method underneath the images route, you can see there's 2 buttons kind of right in the main section of this route details. There's the attach authorization, which I plan on tackling next week if you're around. And then there's attach integration, and this is where you would hook it up with our Lambda function. So let's attach integration, and we're going to create and attach an integration. That's the right route. Our integration type is going to be a Lambda function. You can see if I drop this down, there's tons of different things that you can integrate with, but we're going to select Lambda function. And we created everything in US East 1. Let's select our upload image function, and everything else can pretty much stay the same. Go ahead and click create. Okay, James says feeling streamy. Streamy? It's an odd adjective. You planning on doing something tonight? You'll have to let me know. Okay, so we got our new route added. Let's also actually add another function in here. I completely forgot about this one. So the flow inside of the application with the code, what we're going to do is as soon as we upload the image and receive that URL back, we're going to initiate a put request up into API into Lambda, so we can save our data up in Lambda or up in Dynamodb. Excuse me for that. It sounded weird. Yeah, that was an interesting adjective. So okay, let's head back into Lambda and let's create one more function in here. Let's create a function, and we're going to name this function update to do function. And same thing, set our execution role to use an existing role, the same one that we created last week. This is this Vue To Do App role, and click create function. Okay, and then same thing here. I got some sample code that I've written already. You know what we can actually do is we'll just manually type this one out. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of everything in here. So as with the previous function, we have to import our AWS SDK. So const AWS equals require AWS SDK. And then since we're not using S3, we actually need to create the DynamoDB document client. So we're going to const client equals new aws.dynamodb document client. Document client. So this is the object that we're actually going to use to store data in DynamoDB. And now we need to create that event handler that we've done with all of our functions that are required for Lambda. So exports handler equals, and we're going to do an async function. So async event is what we need to pass in. That's an arrow function. So there's the main portion of our function. So let's create a response object. Response equals open close bracket. This is what we're gonna, once we determine whether our function, we're gonna wrap the main logic of our function inside of a try catch, and then depending on what happens, we'll update the response before we return it. Okay, so I'm gonna type in the same code that we typed in earlier. So let body equals event.body. This is that little snippet that kind of detects whether or not it's a local test or if it is it's the data that's coming in through API gateway. So if type of body is triple equals to string, so we're detecting if it is a string. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go body equals json.parse body. So we're converting it. If the data that's coming in is a string, we're going to convert it to JSON so we can work with it a little easier. Right, add a couple lines here, and now we need to define the parameters that we're going to be sending up into DynamoDB. And this is going to be a little bit different than some of the stuff we did last week, because DynamoDB works off of expressions, which is kind of similar to SQL. If you've ever worked with SQL Server, or any, I guess not just SQL Server, but any SQL, it's a little more verbose than just passing in normal data. You can configure DynamoDB to just pass in just a simple object, and it'll store it, since it is technically a NoSQL database, but we're doing everything on top level. We're not storing anything nested. So we need to write it in this way. So let's create our params object. Const params equals, just open an empty object. So the first thing we need to define is the table name, and that is going to be Vue To Do App. And next thing we need to do is we need to tell DynamoDB what the key is. This is basically, since we're going to be doing an update, this would be similar to finding the ID of, well, it is exactly the same thing as finding the ID of the object inside of a SQL table that you want to update. So our primary key we've defined is named object, or is named ID, and we know that's coming in from body.id based on how we have our Vue app set up. So now we need to define what's called the update expression, and this is kind of along the lines of what I was talking about with actual like straight SQL. So update expression. And this is going to be a string. So the operation we're going to perform is going to be a set. And now we need to throw some variables in here that we're going to use to replace in our next block of the code. So I'm going to use hash task underscore name, which is going to be the name of the task, equals :name. And then since we're passing in an image URL, we're also going to do image URL equals :image URL. The reason, so there's a little bit of a difference here, and I kind of wanted to explain this. So the name of the actual column, if I go back to DynamoDB, let's just bring this guy back up. If I head in here into DynamoDB, go to items, you can see my column here is actually name. Unfortunately, name is and I didn't realize this when we were doing this last week, but name is a reserved keyword up in DynamoDB. You can't pass in an expression with name as being one of the properties of it. So what we're going to do, and this will, like I said, this will make a little more sense once you see this all laid out, is we're going to take this object called hashtag task name, and we're going to end up telling DynamoDB that this actually maps to the name column in DynamoDB, and then the :name are going to be the variables that we're going to replace with our actual data. Now, since image URL isn't a reserved word, we don't have to do this. So this is like setting the column name image URL equals :image URL. Okay, so let's move on. And then the next thing we need to define is expression attribute values. And this is where we define those variables that we're going to swap out as part of our string. So we're going to say :name, and we're going to set that to body.name, and then :image URL. and we're going to set that to body.imageURL. Okay, so that now this is done, and then the last, I guess there's two more things we need to define here. The expression attribute names is where you can tell DynamoDB to swap out these hash parameters like this with whatever the actual name of the column is. This seems confusing, but realistically, you could write a function around this that kind of dynamically parses all this out and then creates your update expression. Glad I caught that. That would have probably been killing me for a while. Update expression. So you could write some simple function that kind of extracts the data out of your object that you're trying to save and then builds all this for you. We're just doing it manually for the sake of the demonstration. And then we're going to do a quote and then that hashtag task underscore name. And then we're going to set that to the actual name of the column, which is name. And then finally, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to set the return value. So return values, and we're going to pass in updated underscore new. Now, this isn't necessarily useful for our application because we don't actually want to get any data back from the database. But if you were doing like a put operation into the database where you wanted to put it, and then as soon as it comes back, you want to get like all the data that was updated inside of DynamoDB, this would return that. Okay. All right, so now that we've defined our parameters that we're going to pass into DynamoDB, we can actually execute this function. So let's open a try block, and we're going to use await client.update, pass in our params, and then we're also going to tack in a .promise on the end of it, which tells the AWS SDK that we want to use the promise version of this as opposed to using the callback version of this. If this works, then we're going to set the response equals to status code of 200. And then if it doesn't work, we're going to catch this with the error. And then we're going to set the response is equal to status code of 500. And then let's pass back the error, just like we have with our other functions from last week. And the last thing we need to do is return the response. So this is the entire function that will take in our data, update it inside of DynamoDB, and then pass back that response status code to the user. James says, when you check if the body is type of string, what other kind of data might it be? You could technically pass in anything you really want to in the body. I mean, I guess what we're really trying to compare against is if the data is of type string. I'll kind of give you an example of why this is important. I'm actually going to save this, and let's go back to one of our other functions because it's a little bit easier to work with. So if I do, let's go back to add to do function. This is probably the simplest one of them all. So when the request comes in through API Gateway, it will be formatted as a string, even if you send it in as JSON. API Gateway will not automatically convert it to JSON before it sends it to API Gateway. But if you wanted to test this function, and this is why I basically did this, is inside of Lambda, you can create these test events where you can basically build out your own objects to send them to your function and then see how it behaves. So now if I click on test add task, actually let's configure this so we can change out. We'll just throw in a couple of extra random numbers to the ID. So you can see inside of here, this is the object that I want to test with my function. I prefer writing this as JSON. So this is the real reason why I do that. So I can configure my tests up in Lambda as well, and then not have to worry about basically converting this into a string before I send it. Let me know if that makes sense. I want to make sure that that gets through. And then what I can do is let's save this, and then I'll hit test, and then what Lambda will do is it'll take that object, send it through my function, and then, you know, show me the execution results up here. So I can see the returned result is a status code of 201. Now, if I did not add that little block of code that converts it to JSON, then inside of my test, I would have to actually cast this, just convert this whole thing to a string, which would kind of be a pain in the ass, and I really don't want to do it. So hopefully that answered that question. All right. So we've got our we've got both of our new functions. Let's go back into API Gateway, and we're going to configure that last route that we need. Let's head here and go back into routes. We're under to-dos. We're going to actually create. We're going to set this to put, and then we're going to use to-dos for our route. Click create, and then do exactly the same thing we did earlier. Select put, attach integration, create and attach integration. And let's go to Lambda function. And let's select update to do function. And click create. Okay, so now that's created. And the last thing we need to do, which I think is actually set up for my testing earlier, but since inside of our execution role, when we were creating those Lambda functions, I selected that Vue To Do App role. We'd have to normally come in here and update our permissions for our Lambda functions to be able to access S3, because inside of AWS, every single service is all in its own isolated sandbox. So just because you're working within your own account up in AWS does not mean the services that you built or that you build will have access to other services within AWS. James says, not quite sure. I guess the question would be, is it not always a string? I've always done a JSON.parse on the body. Okay, so it is always a string. I guess to reiterate, now that I think I kind of understand your question a little bit better. It's always a string that comes in through API Gateway. If you're running the test manually, then it's going to come in as JSON. So that check there is to convert my test JSON or to let me see, how can I explain this a little bit better? So if a request comes in through API Gateway, the body's going to be a string, right, James? So like you're in your Netlify functions where you create your functions, you always have to parse the body out. And Netlify underneath the covers, or Netlify, uses, I'm guessing it probably uses API Gateway too, because I know it's all Lambda functions under the cover. So the reason why you'd have to do that is because the data that's coming in is being a string. So yeah, so the stuff that comes from the test is a JSON object. Now, if I didn't put that code in, I would have to take my test JSON and create a string out of that and then pass that in with the body instead. James says he thinks he's good. Okay, good, cool. So I'm actually going to come in here and I'm going to edit this policy. So Vue To Do App policy is the policy that we created last week when we were doing this. Let's click edit policy. And then I have S3 in here, like I said. I'm going to remove this, and we're just going to save these changes so I can go through the process of this one more time. So if I'm coming in here under Vue To Do App policy, let's click Edit Policy. My headphones turned off again. I think the volume level on my music is pretty low right now, which is why my headphones are thinking they need to turn off. I don't know. So anyway, we're inside of our policy. Let's go ahead and add additional permissions. Let's choose a service and then choose S3. And now there's two specific functions we're interested in with S3. Now, when we did this with Dynamo, we kind of just globally selected everything. But inside of S3, there's only really two we're interested in. If we go to write, we want to select put object. So we want our function to be able to put an object in the S3 bucket of our choosing. And then under permissions management, we want it to also be able to put the object's ACL or access control list. When creating it, inside of the code itself, which I guess we can go back and take a look. I kind of glossed over that. But inside that put object to S3 function, helper function that I have created, there's also this ACL of public read. This is basically what tells S3 that this file is able to be read by any anonymous source. And in order to be able to do that, we need to actually, we need to be able to let our function write that ACL. That makes sense. Basically, we're giving our function permissions to do what it needs to do to upload these files and make them available. James says, cool. So with Netlify functions, I've never been able to send JSON directly, so I've never had to. Yeah, that would be why, because they don't have the ability to test within Netlify that I'm aware of. I go back and forth between Netlify and Netlify. I can't ever seem to settle on one pronunciation. Okay, so those are the two operations that we're interested in, and then under resources, you'll see it wants you to specify what you want this policy to have access to. So I'm going to click Create ARN, and I think I'm going to go back into S3 to pull out the name of the bucket because I have a forgetful memory and I don't want to fat finger this and cause myself a whole lot of trouble debugging, although some part of me feels like we're going to have to debug this at the end of it anyway. So we're going to paste in the name of our bucket there and click on any for object name because we want our function to be able to basically work with any object inside of this bucket. So let's click add, scroll down, click review policy, and then finally save changes. So now our policy should be up to date and we can actually get into updating our Vue code, which is the fun part of this if you ask me. Diamond says Netlify like Netflix. Flix? Fly? Yeah, that is pretty close. I never actually realized that. I mistyped Netlify and Netflix. Ask your wife to go watch Netlify at night. I'm sure it's not going to go over as quite the same. Anyway, so all right, back to I guess our task at hand. So I'm gonna refresh this, make sure that that's still working. Okay, I've got, and you can see we also have our test task that we added from up in our test is also there as well, so it wrote to the database. Okay, so let's get to updating some Vue code. So the first thing we're going to start is with the template. I'm going to modify basically everything inside of our task. I don't think we're going to do a whole lot of stuff outside of the task class itself. No, Netlify and chill. No, that, never mind. I'm not even going to say anything about that. Let's create a new div inside of here. And the reason I'm doing this is because we're going to change the layout of things a little bit. So I'm going to set this to class equals task-main. And then we're going to create another div, and we're going to call it task-image. So div class equals task-image, or img. And I'm also going to throw a vif in here. So vif, actually, I don't have any examples of vif in here. What vif will do basically is if whatever expression you put inside of here results to falsy, I guess it would be, then this block will be hidden and not rendered when the page is loaded. So what I'm going to do is inside of this VF, I'm going to do task.image URL. So if the task does not have an image URL defined, this entire block is going to be hidden. And then inside of here, because, and I'm just going to keep on with this image because this is the easy part of this, is we're actually going to set an image and we're going to set the source. We're actually going to do colon source, src equals. And the reason I'm doing colon source is because if I just did source, Vue is going to expect a string. It's going to treat whatever's put in there as a string. So if I try and put like task.image URL, which is exactly what I need, it's going to try and load an image with the source of task.image URL as a string. It's not going to work. So we got to put the colon in there to tell Vue that, hey, whatever's in here is actually code, and you need to process this first before you apply it to that src attribute. Okay, so then that's basically what we're going to see as far as the image. Now, I'm actually going to take my button. Let's bring this up and put it inside of task main, and I'm going to split this guy up a little bit. So the task, let's see, the task name can stay just the way it is, but I'm going to bring this guy down here, and let's add some spacing around our buttons here. Okay, and then instead of class delete, we're actually just going to call this a class of buttons because we're going to add more than one buttons in here. Okay, so we've got the @click to remove task. Let's duplicate this button, and I'm actually going to, when I was playing around with this earlier, I didn't even think about it last week, but let's put some emojis in here because emojis look a lot nicer than just a straight up X. All right, image. What did I put in here earlier? I think I had some kind of city picture or something like that. I found that was pretty neat. Let's kind of search through this guy here. I don't know what thing looks like. I think it was this guy right here. This is what I picked earlier, and it looked all right when it rendered out. Okay, so instead of remove task, we actually want to browse for image, and there's a reason we want to browse for image. Browse for image. I'm naming this browse for image because this is actually what's going to trigger. This is what's going to trigger the web app to basically open a dialog box up. And then the last thing I'm going to put down here is I'm actually going to add an input with a type of file, and we're going to set this ID, which this will make a little more sense when we get down into the main part of the code. File input and I'm going to put hyphen and the ID task.id. So the ID for this particular input will be file input dash whatever the name of the task, whatever the ID of the task is. And then let's, for the sake of argument, let's just go ahead and close this out and see what this looks like. Let's save this and go back to our code, and you can see this all looks relatively nasty. All these browse things. The reason I create buttons is so this way, when I click a button, it'll open the dialog, and then basically this is all hidden stuff that's kind of behind the scenes that we don't need to see. Let's see, a couple of messages here. James says apply JavaScript. What shortcuts used for emoji? Yeah, Windows plus period will do it. Mac, I don't know the Mac version of that. I think it has one, but I don't know what it is off the top of my hand. But yeah, it's pretty easy. It's pretty nice that I was pretty happy once I found out that I could do that. Give me a second, I need to grab a drink. Coffee keeps me going with these late night streams. Man, I know, James, you're familiar with, you're friends with Brad Garapi. I see the time that he streams sometimes, and I'm like, I don't even know how you do that. I can't imagine, like, 10 p.m., boom, start a stream, stay up for 2-3 hours. No, I can't do that. I could barely make it through an hour on one of mine. Anyway, I'm rambling. All right, so this all looks relatively not pretty. And yes, that is actual coffee with an extra shot of espresso, I might add, because. So what we're actually going to do is I'm going to add another class here, and we're going to call this task. What did I name this thing? I've got to reference my code. File input is what I call this. So we're going to do file dash input, and then we're going to also add another event on here for at change. So this event will happen anytime that this input has changed. So think about it. When we click the button with the image on it, let's go back to our thing. We click this. This is going to basically tell the file input that we want to start browsing for a file. Once the user selects a file, then technically this field has changed. Therefore, we can wire the main logic to upload our image to the change event of this particular field, if that makes sense, which it will hopefully by the time we're done. So we're going to pass in the event. I'm going to define an arrow function here. We're going to pass the event into a function that I have defined called attach image. And that's going to take the event because that's where the file is going to be located. And then also the task. Let's see, do I need the ID? I got just the task. Let's just use the task is fine. Yeah, because we're going to be updating the whole task. So this is what's going to fire once the user actually selects that file. Okay, save. Scroll down a bit. So our code for the most part is done, I believe. Just doing another quick glance at my sample that I got here because I like to have all this stuff set and ready to go ahead of time. Okay, so I'm actually going to head into Dynamo and I'm going to fudge something real quick because again, I was doing testing with this earlier and I do still have some data in here that I'd like to get rid of for the sake of the demonstration. Let's select this guy and just delete it. Delete, okay. And let's refresh to get rid of this broken image looking thing. There we go, so that one's done. Okay, so that's all set and ready to go. So now if I scroll down, before I even get into any of the code, I'm just going to paste in some CSS here just to kind of update the style and the way that things look to make it look a little prettier. This doesn't really affect the functionality of the code, but one of the main things you'll notice is this file input, I have this thing hidden. So that's just kind of one of the things to keep an eye out. Everything else is going to look exactly the same as it was before. So let's save that. Go back and look at the code, and our formatting is back to the way it was before, which is awesome. And now we get to start writing the JavaScript portion of this. So there's going to be, whoop, that's something totally different. So we're going to add some stuff down here. So I'm going to add another, I guess, helper script that I've written and used for quite a while now. This is Git Data URL. So expand out my samples here a little bit. Back and forth. I did not have a lot of time to really kind of prep for this as much as I usually do, so I'm kind of doing it. I'm doing some of the stuff off the cuff. So async get data URL. What this function is going to do is this is going to take the file input from that event and convert it into that base64 encoded URL. Why that's important is because it takes our image, converts it to a string, so we can upload it into AWS for storage. So this thing accepts a file. And the way that this is set up is we're going to create what's called a file reader, which is going to be used to obviously read the file, equals new file reader. Okay, and then this is going to actually return a promise. And we're just going to resolve. We don't need to reject anything off of this. So this arrow function would just resolve. And then reader.onload equals event. It's going to be an arrow function, and we're going to resolve event.target.result. I guess I probably could reject this if it has an issue reading the file, but that's okay. And then reader.read as data URL. The reader.read as data URL is kind of the important thing. But this the onload event is kind of the callback, or the event that's triggered once the file reader has finished reading this file and getting that data URL. So that's why we're resolving the actual result of it reading the file, if that makes sense. Okay, so that function is defined, and that's what we're going to use to actually read the file off our system. The next one is pretty easy. So async browse for image, browse for image. And this is going to take in ID, which is going to be our task ID. And the reason we need the task ID is because that's how we're going to figure out which one of those inputs we need to trigger that click on. So const input L equals document.get element by ID. And let's pass in next string there. So this is going to be file input. This is what we defined earlier, file input hyphen ID. And I have an equal sign. Let's fix that, change that to that. Okay, so there's that. And then the next thing we want to do is trigger a click on it. So input el.click. So that simulates someone actually clicking on that input to try and start browsing for the file. All right, so that one's done. And the last function we need to create is that attach image function. So async attach image. And then this is going to take in the event. And then this is also going to take in the task, the entire task, because we need to, we're going to take the data. We're actually going to take the entire task in so we can update it using our API. So we need to pull I'm going to pull the file out of the event itself. So let file equals event.target.files. Any one of these file selector things, inputs, will always return an array. So I'm going to pick only the first one off it. We're only accepting one file, so we can confidently say that that first file in that array is the one we're interested in. Okay, so then we're going to do let's see, data URL equals await get data URL. That's where we're calling that helper function that we created above. Pass in the file, and this is going to get us that that deal. And to show what this thing looks like, I'm actually just going to console.log it out. So console.log data URL. And let's save this, because this might help things be put into a little better perspective, I suppose. Task is defined but never used. Yeah, hold on. Task and data URL. So ESLint shuts up. Okay, so another test. Let's go ahead and click on the image button. We see we have our browser or file browser that's opened up. Let's go ahead. I know I have a couple of images in this desktop folder. So let's select like just this guy right here, right? Now, if I go to my console, I didn't fat finger anything. This is actually what the image URL looks like. I don't know if I can make this any bigger. Yeah, it looks like I can. Cool. So in the beginning part of it, you have data : image, which this is the type of data it is. If you from earlier when we were looking at the Lambda function and we were pulling out the content type, that's where this is pulled from. So everything up until this colon is where that data type is. Then it says base64 because that's the encoding, and then there's this giant long string that is the text representation of our file. And this string is what we're really going to be setting up to AWS for storage. So let's step through this a little bit farther. And let's say, let's create the request body. So let image request body equals, that's going to be a new object, and we're going to set the file name is going to equal to file.name, just file.name, and then we're going to set file data to that data URL that we just created, or we just got, file data to data URL. Okay, so that's the body, and then we're going to initiate a fetch on this, but we need to get back the response so we can pull off that URL that's created. So let's image I guess image response equals await fetch. Let's pass in our API URL, and we need to swap out that to-dos with images because that's the route that we have defined. Images, and we're going to pass in an object here of options for fetch. So the method's going to be post. I'm just going to copy this from up here. So the headers are going to be of content type application JSON because that's what we're sending up there. And then the body is going to be JSON.stringify, and then we're going to pass in that image request body that we just created, like that. Okay. So then let's do let image response JSON equals await image response dot JSON. And then finally, let's console.log this out. Let's just take a pause here and make sure the upload image portion of our entire solution is working properly. So let's log out the image response JSON. Okay, so that's saved. Our app file name. Oh, I put an equals there. Little C# came out in me. Task is defined but never used. Yeah, I know. ESLint's angry at me because of that. Okay, so we're back to a working solution. Let's go ahead and select an image again. And fingers crossed. Okay, so this is the response right here. We can see we have Vue To Do App images 1, 2, 3, s3.u is east1, yada, yada, yada. And then the name of my file is snag-0260. So if I'm going to control click on this to open this into a new file, a new tab. Here's our image. If we go up into S3, this thing load, go into our bucket that we created earlier. We now have a folder. As you can see, like inside of the URL, let's go back into that image. You can see I have /2020, which is where we created that year, and then the name of the file. So anytime that there's a slash there, that's considered, it's not technically a folder. It's part of the overall name, but S3 will give it a kind of a file folder structural representation when you're viewing this thing. So if I click on this, you can see here's the actual document that we created, and there's a bunch of other metadata that's stored alongside it. Yeah, so that part is working, which I'm entirely shocked. Was that the one that I created off the cuff? No, that one I copied and pasted. This update, the update one, I'll be interested in. This thing works off the, right away. All right, so we have our file, what do I call it? File URL, image URL. So we have image URL, which is the response. And let's go back into our code and let's bring this thing all the way home by creating another request up into our API Gateway instance to actually update the image or update the task with the image that we just created. So we will say, let's see here, task.image URL equals image response JSON.image URL. Image response JSON.image URL. So we're taking the image URL from that response and giving it to the task, and then we're going to await fetch. And then we're going to pass in our same URL. I'm not going to type all that out. We're going to copy and paste that in here. And this is going to be to-dos. To-dos, if I can spell that right. We need to pass in another object. But same thing. I'm going to copy all this from here so I don't have to retype all that back out. This is actually going to be a put, because that's what we define for update. Updating is often used is either put or patch, and they're handled a little bit differently. If you want to get like real strict on convention with APIs, put rips and replaces. Put is actually generally used for two things. Put can be used for creating an object or updating an entire object in an API, also called an upsert. If you ever want to look into some pretty cool stuff for an implementation, patch is designed to replace like one or two fields. Again, it just depends on how strict you want to get with that. But instead of passing in the image request body, like we're just going to pass in the entire task, and our function should be able to pull all that data off and update it. And the last thing we need to do, and this is kind of a Vue thing. Since we are updating an object inside of an array inside of our data, okay, so stepping back for it, inside of our data properties here, we have this tasks defined, which is an array, right? If you update a top level property inside of your data elements or inside of your data properties, fields, whatever you want to call them, Vue will automatically refresh your page. However, since we're updating something inside of an object, Vue is not really monitoring it, so it's not going to know to refresh the page. So the simple trick around this is to use this $force update. And this will basically tell Vue, when this operation's done, I want you to re-render the page because something has changed. It's a way of kind of like strong-arming it to do what you want to. Okay, so let's save that, and moment of truth, let's test this whole thing out from start to beginning. Let's click another test. Do that guy. Holy cow, it worked. I'm kind of shocked because I wrote all that out manually. I mean, I was referencing something, but it's pretty easy to fat finger something. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. Let's refresh this actually before I celebrate too much. Let's refresh and make sure our image gets pulled down. Oh, it doesn't. Uh-oh, something did break. Now we get to go debugging. All right, so let's go to upload image function. And this is where these tests get really handy. James, can you explain that force re-render one more time? Yeah, so inside of Vue, Vue will automatically monitor these top level data elements. So this is kind of these are the data elements that we have access to inside of our Vue app. I'll make some space here so we can see this a little better, right? So inside of here, I have a new task input, and that is bound to this guy right here. That's the string for this. That's where it's bound to. And then I also have an array of tasks, which is being used to show a list of all of our tasks, right? And that's where that data is stored and where we can access it. If you update something on the top level, meaning like if the value of new task input is updated, or if the entire array for the tasks is updated, Vue will automatically re-render the components. Okay, so the actual pieces of the page themselves will refresh. Since we are updating a task which is an element inside of an array, it's an element. It's an element. It's an object inside of an array. Vue will not actually automatically refresh that without a little bit of help. So the way you can tell Vue that some update's been done and I need you to re-render is by adding this line of code in here. And then Vue, once it sees that, will go ahead and refresh itself. Okay, so let's go in here. I'm actually going to check to see live debugging with AWS. Anything that's done in AWS, you can console.log it out, and I actually upload image function. Oh, I did do that. Okay, so I got my console.log error. Okay, so all right, anything you console.log inside of a Lambda function will be logged out to CloudWatch, and CloudWatch is AWS's kind of universal logging system for everything. So if I go in here, do I have it? I don't. So let's search for CloudWatch. CloudWatch. And let's see if this caught anything. Go to, oh no, the image upload worked fine. What am I talking about? I have to go back into Lambda and go, it was the update to do function that seemed to not work properly. I kind of ran into this earlier and I can't remember what I did to fix it now. Okay, so I have update to do function. There's nothing in here though, so that doesn't really help me. So then James, you had asked earlier about like how, I guess, well, you didn't really ask, I guess I can answer that. But as far as these test operations go, so now that I know that CloudWatch didn't catch anything, which is kind of strange, but it didn't. So we can actually see what the results of this are if we pass in a test manually. So what I'll do is I'm going to configure test events, and then I need this. The first thing needs to be the body because that's what we're reading off of. Come on, keyboard. Thought my keyboard just died for a second. That would not have been good. Pepcak says, is the CloudWatch thing automatic? It's supposed to be. I've seen instances where it doesn't, like the permissions don't get set up the right way. In fact, I'd make a fair bet it has something to do with our custom policy now that I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking that's probably the case, but I'm not gonna bother going through and testing this because this is a little bit quicker and easier right now. But yes, in a perfect world, if you go through the standard Lambda function setup and let it create its own policy, it'll automatically grant itself permissions to CloudWatch, and that happens automatically. So I'm guessing that's a policy thing that I don't care to. I'd rather not debug that right now. I'm gonna stick with doing this. So I have our body here, and then let's head back to here and let's go to the network tab, and I'm gonna take a look. Oh, this did refresh. Let's try and upload the image again. The image, post, put. Oh, this did return. Wait, it's interesting. This actually did return and seems to have worked properly. What did the response look like? Oh. So you remember how I said earlier, once you update your code and you have to deploy it when you're done? I actually don't think I did that with this one. So let's go ahead and deploy it and let's try this again. The reason I knew that is because the default response from a Lambda function, if you haven't done anything with it, is hello from Lambda, and that's the response that I got. All right, so I'm going to refresh my whole page to get rid of that fake image thing, and let's go ahead and click that, and I got a 500, which means something didn't work right. So we're kind of back to the same, back to the square one where we were before. But at least I know that was part of the issue. So if I click request, let's copy off the body from our network request. And let's just head back in here and configure test events. Save my body here, so I'm gonna paste that in. Actually, let's get rid of these square brackets here. We'll paste that in nice and long like that. And then I'm gonna use the format JSON button at the bottom to reformat this stuff. And then we'll say test update task. And let's go ahead and create our test here and run it. Test. So it says, even though it says succeeded, the status code is 500. That's because I have it inside of a try-catch block. I would make a bet that I probably did mistype something here. So let's see what we got here. Express attribute names. So expression attribute values, expression attribute names is what we're interested in. Hopefully that was the only thing. So I Control S to save. Go ahead and deploy our code out one more time. And instead of doing it from the UI, since I already have this set up, I'm gonna go ahead and just click test one more time, and I got a 200. So it looks like that was the thing. I misspelled something. Let's try this again one more time from the front end. So I'll refresh this. You can see since our image was actually stored, the image URL was actually stored inside of our table. I can actually demonstrate or show that as well. Tables, Vue To Do App, items, and then here's the image URL that we uploaded. Let's try one more. So we'll go, this is a task. Let's upload this woman here. So it uploads, it displays the task because we had set that VIF there. So because now it actually has a value, it's evaluating true. And that's why that gets displayed. And if I refresh my table here, I should have 2 with images, and I do. So folks, there you have it. That is kind of an idea of how you'd work with uploading files into AWS. And then yeah, that's kind of an explanation, start to finish, on how this whole process works. So it was actually went a little bit longer than I thought it was. I thought this was going to be a relatively quick one, but it went a whole hour, which is usually about how long I stay on. So with that, again, this was supposed to be a 2-part series that is now a 3-part series, which is likely going to be a 4-part series. So next week, I plan on tackling authentication with this exact same setup. So we're going to explore a service called AWS Cognito, which is used to as a user store solution. You can do OAuth with it. I use it for some of my pet projects that I have set up. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with it. So we're going to be exploring that. And I think what we're going to try and do is actually integrate Google login to this system. So this way you can sign in with your Google account or Microsoft account or something like that. I don't know. We'll see how far that thing goes. But yeah, feel free catch me next Wednesday, 8:30 p.m. Central, unless specified. Follow me on Twitter Follow me on Twitter at BrianMMDev is my handle. That's the best place to see any updates to what I've got going on as far as the stream goes, content on my blog, all that kind of stuff. If you're still around, if you haven't done so already, please feel to like the video, subscribe to the channel to see new content that's coming out. And last thing, if you are interested in chatting with me directly, my Twitter DMs are open, but the best place to talk with me is on my Discord. You can access that by going to fullstack.chat. And yeah, we're a friendly little community of developers. We talk about dev and pretty much anything else that's going on in the world. So yeah, come on down there. And with that, I'm done. So everybody have a fantastic evening, and I will see you all soon. Bye-bye.